And but this will require thinking things like return to the body, returning to negativity, returning to the real, and so on and so forth. Some other thoughts that came up, I'll just say, on this idea of embodiment, I always think it's interesting because when I think about class consciousness, it's interesting how class consciousness, I think, is divided along relations to the body. The blue-collar worker often comes home from work tired and they don't have time energy, as Dave McCarricker talks about it at Theory Underground. There is a real sense in which time energy is a bodily and embodied experience. And I think it's always very interesting to me how many white-collar people are into extreme sports, long-distance running, these extreme sports, as if they're just hungry at the end of the day to do some extreme sports. And I think that shows a pretty fascinating difference in the relationship to the body. So I think class consciousness also reflects a body consciousness that the reason why I also think that's pretty important is because if we don't return to the body, then you can't identify with those different modes of consciousness. And also the body will continue to be scary. Because, I guess what I would say is there's this idea in Marx of once you, especially following Lukács, is the proletariat rises up over the bourgeoisie and then dissolves the proletariat class, like the idea of seeing the world according to class, right? Well, the issue is a lot of people identify with their class and they like their class because that's a return to the repressed, the neurotic, right? Mm-hmm. And if you want to have any chance of people wanting to dissolve class, people hate class, they hate being in the lower class, but then if you say people don't have class at all, that tends to, overwhelm them, and there's a return to the repressed, return to the neurotic. I think we see this in Tocqueville with democracy. I think we see this Wondheim did that great presentation on the Cultural Revolution with Mao. I think we see it there. I think we see it, when Louis Demond talks about the caste system, is this idea that humans, we tend to seek a way to organize ourselves. And so if you dissolve class consciousness or social consciousness or kind of ways of understanding ourselves, we tend to return to the repressed, right? Well, if we want to not have that occur, I do think embodiment in the sense of coming to terms with libido, sexual difference, anger, all of these things are going to be really, really necessary. And these are embodied. These are in the body. And I think people's understanding of class also reflects body differences, and if those are not things we can think and kind of integrate with and accept, we're probably actually going to fall back into wanting class consciousness. Because dissolving class consciousness, you've got to be then ready for the reality of the body. And if you're not ready for that, then you're going to fall back into various forms of repression. And the body, again, the body is very interesting because in Christianity, because there's such an emphasis on the body and the flesh. And you have the nails and the hands and the scars and Flannery O'Connor kind of emphasizes the bread as being real bread, or Gilead with Mary Robinson. All these people are saying, really stressing, or Wynne Collier, really stressing the body and the smelly and the touch. And these are the things where God is found. God is found in the physical, in the finite, in the body. And if you don't talk about the body, or you're not ready to handle the reality of the body or the emotions that you have, I think about Aspasia's work and all these things, then you can remove class consciousness all you want, and it will come back. They'll return to it in various forms. You can free people from government or aristocratic identification, as Tocqueville talks about, and they'll create new ways of social mapping, which is a return to the repressed. So we have to come to terms with the body. And with that, for the Christian, I think it's just really important to realize that if God becomes flesh and he incarnates, the Father comes into the world through the Son, then God is always bodied. And actually that can be a revelation that there is no divide between the spirit and physical, that the soul is the structure of the body. Like the body is the structure of the soul. They're inseparable. It's like the Eucharist. Substance, subject is substance. Bone is spirit. The spirit is a bone. It's Eucharistic. They're incarnational. They're two sides of the same coin. And if God becomes flesh at one point of history, then God is always flesh, because God is in all time at the same time. Furthermore, if God becomes Jesus and dies on a cross, then God is always dying. He is always suffering subjective destitution, and he is always in hell. And so you have to then, if you want to be like Christ, or to kind of follow God's lead, or to reflect God in your life, you have to do these things as well. There is absolutely scars on God's back. That, God himself has cuts in his hands. And if you can't view God as a perfect big other, you have to view God as going through that suffering. And from that suffering is then if we take as it teaches, the Spirit is released on the cross, then that death of God, that dying of God, it's like this dying of God. I mean, there's a real sense in which God is always dying on the cross. He is always suffering subjective destitution. And yet that dying is also a source of the Spirit that makes forth communities of subjective destitution that are where it is possible then to have something more rhizomatic and psychotic, in a good way, costly delusionism, that is the only way to address the current situation of global pluralism that is now possible because we have a social coordination mechanism that if we do not do, we will continue to have returns to the repressed. We will continue to have more and more people just find out that desire works by denying the object, and in knowing that, does it still work? It's all just going to get more and more crazy, basically. So we have to accept all these things. And I think also, like something Cadell and I talked about, is that we need to choose the hard road. This is all hard, but we need to choose it. Because if we don't choose it, it will find us. And then we won't be prepared for us, and it will destroy us. So we have to choose it, because then we'll be prepared for it. And so then when the real shows up and it surprises us, we can handle it. When the other shows up, we'll be prepared and we won't be overwhelmed. So we need to choose the hard road. And there's a real way in which one could see the meaning crisis, as Vervaekian people talk about, as what follows when you don't choose subjective destitution. It's still coming for you. It's going to come. You're just not going to be ready for it, and then it will overwhelm you, and you'll be destroyed. So there's also a way in which, when I talk about choosing subjective destitution, I would associate that with the absolute choice. You commit to something and you stick to it. And in that commitment, you see, here's the funny thing about drive. This is why drive has a way of giving us, it's a return to the repressed, but a sublimation of anger into consistency, as Cadell and I were saying. Because when you have drive, you consistently do something. Thus, you put a certain restriction on what you can do, but in that consistency of what you do, you actually are not, you're driven now. You have an intrinsic motivation. You can leave Plato's cave on your own, and there's a beauty that comes from that, but it's a passion. The passion of Christ. Passion is beauty and suffering together. Beauty can destroy you. Cadell was talking about that with ayahuasca. Like that, the experience of this great beauty that can destroy you. Well, that's kind of what drive is like. And communities of drive have this combination of the beautiful and the destructive together. But what you see in drive, like if you say, I'm going to do philosophy, then you are saying I'm going to repetitively and consistently force myself to do this thing. So there's a kind of restriction you put on yourself, but it's a limit you choose. The difference between subjective destitution and, say, the meaning crisis is choosing the limit, choosing to commit yourself to something, like the Nietzschean child, as we talk about in Belonging Again. You are choosing the limit. You are choosing the hard road versus it finds you. And we really do need to choose this because it seems like the gig is up. Like we were saying with Eminem, chose subjective destitution, Cadell was emphasizing, Kendrick Lamar. If you don't choose the hard road, you're going to end up like a Drake or a Diddy, like Cadell was saying, or all these mega church pastors who end up in scandal. So we have to choose the hard way. If we do not choose the hard way, then we will not create these structures of community that have this ability to be consistent, but avoid a return to the repression that can open before it is too late. They open because the other can function as an infinite source of opening, because just when you're about to close, it opens again. So, if you're in a world that increasingly, like Barry Taylor, I thought he put it really well when he said, the game is desire can't get its object. That's the situation. Desire cannot get its object. That's the situation. What are we going to do about it? Continue to act like it can? Well, that's going to destroy us. That's going to just lead to what I call self-effacement. Okay, so desire can't get its object. What now? All right, we need to sublimate, because Hegel, Cadell and Michel had this lovely talk on sublation and sublimation going together. If sublimation is where you say take anger into drive. You don't let anger destroy you. You take the body. There's something this is why we were saying you have to get to the body, because there's something, if you want to sublimate, you need to really be in the body and face the body and take the body seriously in materiality. This is, and this would get into Seth's work, Aspasia's work, et cetera, so forth. So you have to take the body. You can get in Gurdjieff, Lehman, Pascal. I think all of these are related. So you take the body seriously. if you have communities that can sublimate, then you can sublate the entire socio-political situation. And basically, right now, people are aware that desire doesn't work, that it leads to all this craziness, but there are not the material conditions. And this, Dave and Marx emphasize, Dave will say that one has to study Marx because he takes material conditions seriously. And I think all the sociologists are teaching you that our habits and habitus and meta-judgments and valuations and I of value, as Gaffney and Stein might say, all of these tend to be based on our material conditions. But I would stress with material conditions as medium conditions, as things that work on our loves, as James K. Smith says. They condition and incubate our habits and our habitus and our ways of thinking that if that's not all there, which I think is now possible with the liminal web, with a system coordination mechanism, but if it is not there, then there is no way for people to, at scale, unless you're just randomly lucky, which of course occurs, but, there's a kind of that's kind of like the movement of the spirit, kind of like grace. But, if you're lucky, you may sublimate into drive, but at scale, it won't. And so it makes sense that everyone would return. There would be this great return of the repression, or this return, or this move to the first turning that is a bit neurotic. It would just make sense, because what else are people going to do? They don't have the material conditions to do something else. They don't have time, energy. They don't have creativity. They don't have drive. So what are they going to do? So we have to create these material conditions, these medium conditions, which, we talk about in belonging again. But we're not going to do it if we don't take seriously the breaks and think the breaks like Zizek does. And there were some other things, like if you don't choose subjective destitution, the hard road will still find you, and then you'll probably be destroyed by it. If you don't reconcile yourself, Hegel, Dimitri and Dylan were talking about reconciliation with the future in Hegel. If you don't reconcile yourself with the incompleteness of reality in a Gödel sense, the incompleteness will find you and it will destroy you. If you're ready for it, then I think the very incompleteness of reality can actually be the source of intrinsic motivation. Because reality is incomplete, you can have drive. It is hard for me to imagine the possibility of drive in a complete reality. And also a complete reality seems like it would be dead because it'd be a closed system, so it wouldn't be negentropic, and it seems like it would die. And incompletion also seems like the incompletion can function as a constraint, and one can think of Terence Deacon here, and Kaufman and other people, where constraint creates order. And so the incompleteness puts a constraint on completion that then makes an order and logic and negentropy to completion, which is complete in its incompletion, in that encounterology, or limits that are limitless, as Vervaeke, as Alec Diebert stresses, and I always enjoy speaking with him. But you see, what's all so strange about all this is that it suggests that it's really subtle distinctions. I know Mark was talking about the subtle body, but there's like these subtle distinctions, like the subtle difference. Everything is good, but if you put second things first, you lose both. And there is this idea in Augustine that evil is a disordered good, and so, God is held to those who hate him. And if you relate to God and you don't choose subjective destitution, like the only way to approach God is through subjective destitution. I think Cardinal Newman in Grammar of Assent, there's this idea that he put forth where purgatory is the bath you take so that when you go before God, you're not dirty, and if you're dirty before God, you're overwhelmed by shame, and it becomes hell, right? So subjective destitution, purgatory, if we take that, Dante, etc., is the only way to not be destroyed by heaven. If you don't go through purgatorio, the cross, then love is Lovecraft. You're reduced to ask by Beatrice, so you have to go through this. So there is a sense in which there is evil in God, per se, but that evil is a result of a disordered relation to God, right? Likewise, there is hell in God, in a sense, because God is held to those who hate him, right? So there's this way in which everything is good if rightly ordered. But the weird thing is you can't rightly order your relation to everything without subjective destitution, which seems incredibly counterintuitive. Why would you ever think that subjective destitution is the way you rightly order your relationship to everything good? Well, it is. And so if you have communities that avoid subjective destitution rather than atheism, Christianity, or so on and so forth, then all the potential good will turn into hell. And it's very weird, because it does seem like the best things in life are also the things that can destroy you. Marriages can be hell. Relationships can be hell if you're not ready for them, if you don't rightly order them. So there's this very odd thing where everything comes down to our ability to rightly order first and second things, be prepared for the most important things so they don't destroy us. And yet the way we do that is through a subjective destitution. But here's the other really difficult trick, and this is why the other seems so important. Because whatever we think is subjective destitution easily is simply our idea of subjective destitution. It seems like subjective destitution must surprise us. It must surprise us, because if we plan it, then we're ready. It's not really subjective destitution. It's not really the real. The real is when things don't work, as Cadell said. Well, no one can plan for things not to work. This is a big emphasis of St. Augustine. You can't have a bad intention. If you intend for something bad, then it's actually good. If you intend to hurt yourself, then it's good if you hurt yourself, right? The real is when stuff doesn't work. That means it has to surprise you. And so subjective destitution has to be a surprise. Well, what in the world? How do you get a surprise? Well, you have to commit to something. You have to have a consistency. You have to pour your heart and soul into something. The only way to have something go wrong is to do everything in your power for it to go right. And that's devastating. But it is that very devastation that is a necessary precondition to be able to handle and to keep and to grow with the most important things of life that if you're not ready for, become hell. Like if you do not go through this, then the experience of God becomes Lovecraft. Beatrice reduces you to ash, a simile, like the canto in Paradiso. But how do you plan for subjective destitution that is fundamentally unplannable? I think it's the other. You have to have the other. You have to have these communities where you can encounter the neighbor, the good Samaritan, which again, I would say to Christians, the only way to understand the shocking element of that story is to read it as the good atheist. Christ is kind of saying, I'm the good atheist. Well, that's nuts. And it would also suggest that today, especially for the American Christian, thinking something like Christian atheism might be the only way to really come to Christ. Because otherwise, we're just falling into a symbolic of how we think of Christ, which likely just falls into the comfort our frenemy brain wants us to fall into so that we don't go through the subjective destitution for the possibility of the Holy Spirit, which then you could say is all one giant act of blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. And Jesus warns that that's a really bad thing. And so, another thing I would just say is that there's a way to read so many of the quote-unquote moral commands of Jesus as basically saying you cannot return to the repressed. There's ways that lying is how you can return to the repressed, or you can avoid facing negativity. There's a way where sexual deviation can be avoiding negativity, because you're always just going to the next sexual object, objectifying people, and you're never facing the real of people. Gluttony can be a way where you're always acting like the object of desire will fulfill you if you just eat enough, right? So a lot of, in my opinion, of what are kind of moral tenets, quote unquote, are actually lessons of not avoiding subjective destitution, of not giving into self-deception. So now I'd have to expand on that argument, but I think it's very important, because otherwise, because another thing, there is this tradition of thinking of Jesus, that Jesus presents us with an impossible moral standard. No one can be moral like Jesus. No one can do it. So then the idea is that Jesus shows us a standard we can't meet. He acknowledges we can't meet it, and so he has to die for our sins so that, to make up for our shortcomings. Now, even if there is some legitimacy to this notion, it can be dangerous because it suggests the impossible is something we shouldn't try to do. We have to try the impossible. No one can be like Jesus, but that's the point. The point is you can't, and you must think it, and you must tarry with it. And go through, genuinely experience with your body, not just with your mind, the subjective destitution. And again, Jesus says, if you do not love your neighbor, you do not follow, love your neighbor as yourself and love God with all your heart, and they're the same command. Well, that suggests you don't love God if you don't try to love your neighbor who could be out to kill you. So I think one has to be careful about theologies that simply sets Jesus' life up as an impossible standard, so that then it legitimizes a certain atonement theology by which we are saved. I think you can definitely have a theology where you say that Jesus closes the divide between man and God. And he goes to all possible experiences, and this came up in the Wrestling with Christianity series on Sin Space, where he closes all possible ways you can end up in life, and God can be there, and that would include hell. And that we don't necessarily have to have a penal substitution doctrine. And then in that idea that God goes everywhere you go, you also then place the cross in God, the Father. And also, too, please note, if God creates the world knowing that means he'll send his Son, himself, in his Son, to die on the cross, then that means God creates knowing that means he's going to put himself in hell, put himself through that suffering and that great, great sorrow and death and misery. God will identify with that, and he knows he will, and yet he chooses it anyway. And so if we want to be like Christ, which has a certain likeness to the Father, then we have to similarly choose to commit ourselves to a creation that will cost us And if you do not do this, you will not be like Christ. And again, there are certain atonement doctrines that can get in the way of people making that absolute choice. And that's what we have to be very, very careful about. I think so. Also it should note, like Peter Rollins was saying, demand, desire, drive. I think we can associate the demand with the task society, came up in the Lovecraft presentation, in the Lecrie conference. You can locate the desire with the voice society, and this gets into voicecraft, and where we need training like voicecraft. And that desire makes way to the sublation of drive. And so I think those things overlap. But all of that requires the space, the encounter space of Christian atheism as being put forth, where Christianity encounters atheism and atheism encounters Christianity. This is for others to encounter others, to avoid, to get away from the big other for the other. I think the atheist is the other for the Christian. They demonize the atheist. But if they don't encounter the other in the atheist, the good atheist, the good Samaritan, then Christianity will fall into a neurotic structure. It will be a return to the repress, and it won't create drive. It will not create drive. It will not create intrinsic motivation, because there won't be beauty. Because there's something about the encounter of the other that creates beauty. The absolute idea at the end of science of logic, Gödel associates with beauty, and I agree. And there's something about all of this that is the creative female liaisons. It is the psychotic, but it is the community. All of this creates this mysterious spirit that you darn well know when you experience it, but you can't put it into words outside of the experience, as is the most important things of life. You have to experience it to get it, but that doesn't mean it's not concrete. In a way, the more ineffable something is, the more concrete it might be, precisely because words are not experiences. And if you can't put it into words, that might mean you really experience the concrete. And in fact, very rarely do we ever use words in a manner that really gets at the concrete. We tend to be very bad at adverbs and adjectives and descriptions, and very rarely do we ever describe a day well. So there's something about the ineffable that can be more concrete, and the female liaisons that is more concrete. And it is a certain, flow or cipher or the beauty when you experience it, but precisely that knowledge is an excess that cannot be brought into the neurotic of language. There is something neurotic about language, some kind of authority that shuts down the excess of the signified into the signifier. The signifier tries to deny the excess, and the value of Derrida is to say, well, there's always a deferral, there's always an excess, that a signified that is not captured in the signifier. And I think that excess is the female liaisons, where there tends to be most liaisons is repressive, a return of the repressed. So the question is, what you see in drive is a way where repression becomes more of a kind of a chosen repression, which then is a consistency, and that consistency is what makes possible a surprise. And the sum of that, which is ineffable, something that's really hard to get unless you do it, is the female liaisons, in a way. It is the Beatrice. It is the beauty. You have to have this commitment. It is the surprise that is only possible because of the commitment. And the commitment has a certain madness to it, because why would you commit to something that isn't guaranteed or something might not go anywhere? But that is precisely what makes possible the beauty. So the female, there's a creative to it. It has a certain mystery, a certain spirit, a certain evanescence. I think the female liaison, it does resonate with the notion of spirit. Moltmann, maybe the crucified God, the spirit of God, something of the spirit of light. It talks about how the word spirit is rahi, I think, R-A-H-I, which means kind of like breath and wind. And there's this idea that spirit is this animating principle that comes and goes, and it's kind of mysterious, and it's here, and then it's not here, and so on. And I think the female liaison is an enjoyment of that evanescence, that coming and going. But in order to capture that coming and going, there has to be something consistent, a body, something that has, again, because the condition for the possibility of drive seemed like it has to be desire, which, again, doesn't get its object, but that is the structure, lack, essential lack, that is what makes possible intrinsic motivation and drive and excess. You'd have to have lack for excess. And you enjoy the tension of that. You enjoy that dialectic. You enjoy the creative and trust in and have faith in the creativity of that process. But it's all fragile. Something else we talked about is how the key to these kind of rhizomatic liminal web network, we talked about networks and community and how communities can be neurotic and networks can be more of the rhizomatic, this costly to lose, but it can also be overly psychotic. But if the kind of combination of those as the liminal web, or the liminal, to just use that phrase, we talked about how that's fragile. But precisely because it's fragile, it can be magical. It can have this spirit. It can have this kind of magic where this thing can happen that doesn't seem like it can happen anywhere else, and yet it doesn't seem like it should hold together, and yet it does. And we mentioned the difference between like the network, the liminal, philosophy portal, voice crack, etc., theory underground, and say institutions like a Goldman Sachs or DC. Like in a Goldman Sachs, like we talked about institutional subjectivity, where, you know, Goldman Sachs, you are dispensable. We don't need you. It will just keep going. But in the network, every person is indispensable. You cannot replace them. They are all one of one. There's a kind of radical white stone name at the end of the book of Revelation, Turn the World. We talk about Luke, I think, talks about that. And so this one of oneness that defines network subjectivity, which makes it very fragile. If everyone left, if people left, the whole thing could fall apart, whereas institutional subjectivity can go on with institutions, capital nation state can go on without you, which makes them stronger but dead. And so there's something also about the drive, the female jouissance, that has a fragility to it that makes possible a spirit, that makes possible a magic. But that's kind of that's the condition of drive. That is structurally as a medium condition in which drive can be incubated. We just have to keep it going. And this has not been scalable because you have not had a social coordination mechanism. The pricing mechanism is rather new. You couldn't scale capital markets, and we did, but since we didn't also have a social coordination mechanism, we didn't have a kind of subjectivity that could keep capital from replacing our subjectivity with the kind of capitalism consciousness, market consciousness, fungibility, the meta judgment of the equal sign, as I talk about in the situation of capital. We were not able to resist that, and so capital did our socializing for us, which then led to a flattening, a compression of individual difference into consumers and people that have certain jobs, and then we were habituated into that. We loved the simplicity of it. It scratched our itch of needing to know what to believe. Existential stability is the Peirce kind of ethics of belief document he talks about, and we were able to scratch that. And capital did that for us. But now that reductionism, which was the point, it wasn't a mistake, the reductionism was the point, has now led to a nihilism and a meaning crisis. But that's the logical extension of having capital do your socialization for you, which if we as human beings cannot handle the real of difference, if we cannot form communities of spirit under the notion of Christian, this Christian atheist project, if we're not able to do that, then we can't avoid returns of repression or meaning crisis. We can't avoid it because we don't have the subjectivity to handle the alternative. And so we have to have these fragile communities, which in their working, they're magical. But you see, another thing we talked about is there's a lot of emphasis online about relational ontology, relationships, and I'm all about it. But you could almost say there's a difference between passing over and relation. Like passing over in Hegel can't happen if there isn't relation, if ontological isn't relation. But that passing over entails subjective destitution. Like it's the first thing, second things, right? Like if you don't put subjective destitution first, then you can't get your relational ontology. Then you can get your relational ontology, but if you put relational ontology first, you lose both. So it's just critical that when we talk about relations as being ontological and that there are no things, just situations, in Leibniz, the situation is fundamentally a passing over. It is a movement. In Korbasky, my beloved, the Science and Sanity talks about relations as kind of the reformation of a kind of Hegelian logic as necessary for working through negativity. So, it's like when you talk about an evolving cosmos, an evolving consciousness, as Gödel was saying with Palmer, how does that address existential health? Talking about the consciousness, the universe is evolving and complexity and so on. Well, how does that, help me deal with the laundry? After the ecstasy, the laundry, how do I deal with the laundry, right? And so that's where you have to have passing over. You have to have subjective destitution. If we do not do this, then these fragile communities that are, again, already fragile are probably going to shatter because people are not prepared for the inevitable negativity that can only come up in relation because, like Leibniz teaches us, as the great Anthony Morley teaches, it is only when things come together, that the true difference can arise, the one that you could only know in situations. Similar, like, we bring things together because we think we're similar. And the only way to find out that they're not the same and how they're different is in the situation. And that's always going to surprise you. So the only way to encounter, like, you have to have in your relational ontology a surprise of difference, a shock of difference, a difference you did not know was there. And that will emerge. It happens in marriages. I thought we were compatible. Bam, turns out there's a difference, and you're not ready. And if you're not prepared for it, which if you haven't gone through subjective destitution, if you haven't taken up your cross, if you haven't gone through negativity, it is very unlikely you're going to be prepared, and then it will be too late. The hard road will show up, you won't be ready for it, and you will be destroyed by it, like a Lovecraft creature. The love will turn into a Lovecraft. And this kind of preparation is, again, necessary for drive. And communities of drive seem to be the only way to have the rhizome of deluge, a costly deluge, that doesn't lead into atomization, into all of the unintentional consequences of Japan and all of that stuff. And, I talked also about, we could say, like Bonhoeffer in the Cost of Discipleship, he has those lovely ideas of there's a cheap grace and a costly grace. We could likewise say there's a cheap mysticism and a costly mysticism. There's a cheap Christianity and a costly Christianity, a cheap atheism and a costly atheism. Cheap philosophy, cheap relationships, and costly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what is the difference between cheap and costly? It's subjective destitution that you cannot plan, though. You cannot plan subjective destitution, because if you do, then it's not really destitution. It's something you planned. Unless it's just like a lot worse than you planned or something. It like surprises you how bad it is. But then the question is, like, can you only do that once in your life? It seems like it needs to have a regular, like a constant opportunity for surprise. And that seems to require otherness and a community that is always keeping itself from fighting enclosure. And again, if you've, like, the only way to keep mysticism from turning cheap and all of that seems to be to always keep them in relation to the community, the subjective destitution, the real. Like, again, if the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are all connected at all times in a Trinity, well, then, likewise, mysticism, subjective beauty, all these things have to always be together at all times. But, of course, the human frenemy brain will naturally think it is succeeding in this, even when it's not. How do you make sure that it is when it is not? Well, you need surprise. You need the other. You need this way of always realizing your own inadequacy and being humbled in very important and good ways. And like something we also talked about is if you take that seriously, like something churches can do, like church buildings and stuff, is you can see a church and it looks like a church, so you say, oh, I'm not a Christian, that's not for me. And so the very architecture of the building can send signals that only bring in self-similar people. And so, Christians need to think about meeting in warehouses or diners or coffee houses, because you need to make sure your architecture does not send signals that says this is only for a certain kind of people, because if that occurs, you're going to be in trouble. And you're not going to be putting yourself in the regular training ground, gymnasium, Plato, Socrates. You're not going to be putting yourself in the regular training ground by which to work on your capacity to handle otherness. You're not going to be prepared. And if you're not prepared like this and you don't go through this work, you can't have this gradual unveiling with the UN in parentheses, like we talked about with Beatrice and Dante, which is, Beatrice gradually smiles more and more as Dante ascends toward the beauty, the beatific vision, because if she smiles too much, too quickly, Dante will be reduced to ash. So it has to be gradual. So there's this gradual unveiling. So it goes with otherness and the real. We can only handle so much of it at once. But how do it seems really hard to plan that. Like, what does it even mean to have, like, practices where you increase your unveiling? It has to be in the architecture. It has to be in the structure of the building, because the way it appears has to be a surprise. Like the clearing in Heidegger, there has to be a certain surprise. Well, it seems to be architectural. Like, it has to be like a coordination mechanism. It has to be spaces like Voicecraft or a philosophy portal or the internet or churches meeting in warehouses or art galleries, where you're not wearing on your shirt your identification like Christian or atheist or whatever, because you don't want that to scare people off. You want to put yourself in a vulnerable place, but you're also not throwing yourself out there so quickly that you're going to be reduced to ash because the otherness is too much. And this kind of thing seems to be the conditions in which one can learn the sublation of anger into drive, and do so regularly. Because, like, I think Cadell is right, we really Freud really saw that the challenge was anger, not just sexuality, but this kind of anger, this kind of rage, this primal rage underneath in everyone. And if we didn't come to terms with that, it would destroy us. And, the neurotic is a way to silence it. So that's why everyone's returning to the freaking neurotic, right? Because that deals with the problem of anger. But we have to learn how to sublimate anger into drive. And the concern is likewise, the Christian hates the atheist and the atheist hates the Christian. What we need is to have the Father love the Son and the Son love the Father. And of course you say, oh my gosh, if Peterson loved the woke, he would support the woke. But this is what we're not able to think love in a manner that maintains difference, because that's the work of the real, right? You can love someone and disagree with them. That seems impossible. That seems like a contradiction. Exactly. That means we need to think it. That's where the beauty can occur. And again, where you see that kind of anger, that's an indication that we haven't sublimated. We are still dealing with desire. We are still dealing with a lost object that never existed. And the emphasis on myth over drive can just kind of hide that problem, and it's not going to be the female liaisons. And now again, my weird optimism comes from the fact that it does seem to me as if we are at a moment where we have the technology to be able to engage in a coordination of social capital and to create these new architectures of space in which a costly deluge at scale, rhizomatic, yet Zizekian and Deleuzian is possible altogether. It is possible. And again, the fact that we seem to have missed a historic contradiction, it seems like we had to race past it to look back and see it. And now that we are seeing it, and that someone like a Jordan Peterson can help us see it, precisely by calling out the problems of excess in the world today, excess devoid of lack, that's very valuable, but we need a coordination system, like I say with the liminal web, if we don't want to just end up in the anger that I do think we see in a Peterson. Or these weird issues of, forms of atheism or capitalism that just seems to lead to these very odd pathologies that you're seeing, just these weird corruptions and things. So we've got to move beyond that, but it's going to require a spirit. But I do think we have possibilities today for network subjectivity, communities of Holy Spirit, openness to the other instead of the big other. But we just have to remain faithful to the work. We have to have the faithful presence of it, and to just to stay true to it. But it's going to require working through a negativity that is very, very hard to work through. I think what Cadell Last is doing with Philosophy Portal and focusing on Christian atheism is exactly what we need to do. And I think there's a possible magic in it precisely because there is no guarantee of these communities working. But because there is no guarantee, there is they're sustained by drive. They are sustained by people having a drive to keep them going, and to have their drive in a space that is vulnerable, that is open to the other, who can shock them and who can surprise them. And in so doing, that can keep the structure from being enclosed. It maintains a certain openness. And so likewise, if we take a Christian, take the very willingness of God to come down in the person of Christ, then allows access to God. But that comes with the road of subjective destitution, and that subjective destitution is an openness. And so likewise, these network communities, I think, embody that. They embody a certain openness that allows the other in, who can then, in that opening is the choice to choose the hard road, to choose subjective destitution, of which then allows one to be prepared for the real, so that then it can be sublated into beauty. And that's the task today. That's the work. And we close talking about how I do think it's just very interesting to me that a major teaching of Jesus is be not afraid. Constantly he says, be not afraid, be not afraid, be not afraid. And courage is such a big deal. And I think that this is an age of courage. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. And there's a courage that is required. And there is a massive courage required of subjective destitution. There's a massive courage required to put yourself in places where the other can confront you and you can be surprised by the real. But this is an age of courage. Alex Ebert put it well when he said the meaning of life is courage. If we are not courageous, then we do not have a chance of a new address, and we do not have a chance to sublimate. anger into drive. That's only possible with courage. And I think this is an age of courage. I think the work that Cadell is doing at Philosophy Portal on Christian atheism, and I think work like Peter Rollins, all of this is incredibly important. And I do think that Christians need to love the atheist, and they need to absolutely be open to the atheist, and the atheist has a lot to teach the Christian. There are a lot of wounded people in this world. There are a lot of scars, and there is a lot of hurt, and we need to be open to the people around us and to do our best to be vulnerable and open to them as well. None of that is possible without courage. And this is an age of courage. And I think Cadell-Last's work help us think courage, to see models of courage, and to exercise courage, and to learn courage. And I suggest that people sign up for the course. It will be a delight. And thank you so much for your time.